Picture this: a handful of weary soldiers, their backs against the wall, staring down an army that outnumbers them 10 to 1. The air is thick with dust and desperation, the scent of sweat and iron lingering as the enemy advances. There's no escape, no reinforcements coming, just the grim certainty that defeat is inevitable. And yet somehow, against every law of war and logic, they win. These aren't just stories, they're moments where history itself held its breath, where the underdogs didn't just survive, they triumphed in ways that still leave us in awe centuries later. What is it about these impossible victories that grips our imagination? Maybe it's the sheer audacity of defying the odds, the way a single spark of courage can ignite an entire army to fight like legends. Or perhaps it's the timeless lesson that strategy and spirit can outmatch sheer strength. From ancient citadels to medieval castles, there are battles where the defenders should have been crushed, and yet, through ingenuity, grit, or even a stroke of luck, they turned the tide. These aren't just military feats, they're testaments to the unyielding human spirit, proof that even when hope seems lost, determination can rewrite fate. Today, we're diving into 25 of history's most breathtaking underdog victories: the sieges, the last stands, the battles where the defenders had no right to win, and yet they did. Each story is a masterclass in resilience, a reminder that the impossible is only impossible until someone does it. You'll discover how cunning tactics outmaneuvered overwhelming force, how sheer willpower shattered expectations, and how these echoes of the past still resonate today. So settle in, because by the end of this journey, you'll see history's greatest underdogs not just as names in a book, but as proof that even in the darkest hour, victory is never out of reach. The Fortress of Shaijevar wasn't just a mound of stone and wood, it was a carefully crafted death trap. Nicola Zielinski knew his tiny garrison couldn't match the Ottomans in open battle, so he turned the fortress itself into a weapon. Every corridor, every gate, every wall was designed to bleed the enemy dry. As Suleiman's army surrounded the fortress, their cannons roared, but Zielinski had anticipated this. He built layered defenses, forcing the Ottomans to fight for every inch. When they breached the outer walls, they found themselves funneled into killing zones where Hungarian crossbowmen and muskets cut them down in waves. But Zielinski's real genius wasn't just in the fortifications, it was in the minds of his men. He knew despair could break an army faster than any siege engine, so he forged them into something unshakable. Night after night, as Ottoman campfires glowed like a sea of stars, he moved among his troops, reminding them they weren't just defending a patch of land, they were buying time for all of Europe. When supplies ran low, he shared his own rations. When the walls crumbled, he stood in the gap, sword in hand. This wasn't just leadership, it was alchemy, turning fear into defiance. And then there were the surprises. Zielinski ordered his men to dig tunnels beneath the fortress, staging sudden, brutal counterattacks from below. He used the Ottomans' own numbers against them, luring them into narrow streets where their advantage vanished. Even in their final hours, when the inner keep was ablaze and hope was ash, Zielinski led one last charge, not for victory, but for legend. The Ottomans won the battle, but the cost was staggering: nearly 20,000 dead, Suleiman himself dying in his tent, and a campaign delayed by critical months. Szigetvár became a beacon, proving that even against the impossible, a determined few could change the course of history. The English knights had every reason to be confident as they marched toward Stirling Bridge. Their armor gleamed, their horses pranced, and their numbers dwarfed the ragged Scots waiting across the river. Edward I's army was the finest in Europe, a machine built to crush rebellions. But William Wallace and Andrew Moray weren't just outnumbered, they were outmatched in every conventional way. What they had, though, was something the English commanders fatally underestimated: an intimate knowledge of the land and a willingness to exploit their enemies' arrogance. Stirling Bridge wasn't just a crossing, it was a bottleneck so narrow only 2 horsemen could ride abreast. The English vanguard, eager to claim glory, charged onto it without waiting for their full army to assemble. Wallace and Moray held their ground, letting the knights funnel into the killing zone. Then, at the perfect moment, they struck. Scottish spearmen surged forward, blocking retreat while others waded into the river, flanking the trapped English. The bridge became a slaughterhouse. Armored knights, weighed down by their gear, drowned in the murky waters or were cut down where they stood. But the real masterstroke was psychological. Wallace had spent years studying the English playbook, knowing they relied on heavy cavalry to break infantry. By denying them open ground, he turned their greatest strength into a liability. The remaining English forces, watching in horror from the far bank, could only retreat. In one brutal hour, the Scots didn't just win a battle, they shattered the myth of English invincibility. What makes Stirling Bridge legendary isn't just the victory, but what it symbolized. Wallace and Moray proved that terrain could be as deadly as any sword, that patience could outmaneuver brute force. Their triumph didn't just boost Scottish morale, it laid the blueprint for generations of underdogs: fight smart, and even giants can fall. The Ottomans swept toward Eger like a storm, their banners darkening the horizon. 80,000 seasoned warriors against a ragged garrison of 2,000. The math was unforgiving. This should have been a slaughter, but the defenders of Eger had something the invaders didn't account for: a fortress built not just on stone, but on sheer, unbreakable defiance. Captain Istvan Dobo knew his walls couldn't withstand a prolonged siege, so he turned weakness into weapon. His secret: every inch of Eger was designed to make the Ottomans pay in blood. Take the boiling oil. As Ottoman sappers tunneled beneath the walls, Dobo's men didn't just wait, they heated cauldrons of oil until they bubbled like hell's own broth, then poured it into the tunnels. The screams echoed for days, but Dobo's brilliance went beyond gruesome ingenuity. He mastered the art of illusion. When Ottoman scouts reported Hungarian reinforcements arriving, soldiers glimpsed on the battlements in fresh uniforms. It was all theater. Dobo had his men switch clothes, marching in loops to mimic fresh troops. The ruse worked. Ottoman commanders, already frustrated, began doubting their own intelligence. Yet the real heart of Eger's defense wasn't oil or tricks. It was the unshakable bond between Dobo and his people. He didn't rule from a tower. He fought alongside blacksmiths, farmers, even women who smuggled gunpowder in their skirts. When food ran low, he shared his last loaf. When the outer walls fell, he stood in the breach with a pistol in one hand and a prayer on his lips. This wasn't just a battle, it was a covenant. Every defender knew if they faltered, their families would be next, and then came the final stroke. After weeks of relentless assaults, the Ottomans, their ranks thinning, their morale crumbling, caught word of a phantom army marching to relieve Eger. There was no army, just Dobo's last gamble, whispers spread by daring messengers. The Ottomans, humiliated and exhausted, finally withdrew. 80,000 men, defeated by 2,000 souls who refused to kneel. Eger's legacy isn't just in the stones that still stand today, but in the lesson it burned into history. No force, no matter how vast, can conquer the human spirit when it's welded together by purpose. The Ottomans had the numbers, the guns, the empire, but Dobo had something far more powerful: a people who believed against all odds that they could win. And sometimes belief is the deadliest weapon of all. The Mediterranean sun beat down on Malta's rocky shores as the greatest armada of its time appeared on the horizon. Nearly 200 Ottoman ships carrying 40,000 soldiers, their sails blotting out the sea. Against them stood 600 knights Hospitaller and a ragtag force of local militia, barely 9,000 in total. The math was brutal. Even the fortress walls of St. Elmo, St. Michael, and St. Angelo seemed to tremble at the odds. But Grand Master Jean de Valette, a grizzled veteran with fire in his veins, knew something the Ottomans didn't. This wasn't just a siege. It was a chess match where every life bought time, every stone hid a trap, and every setback masked a stratagem. From the first cannon blast, the knights rewrote the rules of defense. St. Elmo, the smallest fort, was sacrificed but not without purpose. Valette ordered its defenders to fight for every inch, knowing their prolonged resistance would bleed the Ottomans white. For 36 days the knights held, their numbers dwindling as Ottoman corpses piled like driftwood. When the fort finally fell, the invaders paid a staggering price, 8,000 dead, including some of their finest commanders. The Ottomans had won a ruinous victory, and Valette had just begun. Then came the masterstroke. As the enemy turned their fury toward Burgoo and Singlia, the knights unleashed a weapon the Ottomans never expected: water. Under cover of darkness, Maltese swimmers slipped into the harbor, driving stakes beneath the surface to cripple enemy ships. Others floated barrels of gunpowder into the Ottoman fleet, igniting explosions that lit the night like hellfire. But Valette's greatest weapon was his men's unity. Unlike the Ottoman forces divided by rivalries and mercenary loyalties, the knights fought as one. When a breach opened in Burgoo's walls, Valette himself, now in his 70s, grabbed a pike and stood in the gap, his coat of arms gleaming as he rallied the defenders. The final act was pure psychological warfare. With supplies running low, Valette ordered his men to fire the last of their precious cannonballs not at the enemy, but into the countryside where Ottoman scouts would hear them. The message was clear: the knights still had ammunition to spare. Coupled with rumors of approaching Spanish reinforcements, it shattered Ottoman morale. After 5 months of carnage, the invaders retreated, their fleet limping homeward. Malta stood, and with it, Europe's southern flank. What makes this victory legendary isn't just the defiance, but the blueprint it left. Valette proved that adaptability trumps numbers, that unity can outlast firepower. The Ottomans had the galleys, the guns, the seasoned janissaries, but the knights had something far more dangerous, a cause worth dying for, and a leader who turned desperation into genius. In the end, Malta wasn't saved by stone or steel, but by the unbreakable calculus of human will. The field at Agincourt wasn't just wet, it was a quagmire, a sea of churned earth that clung to boots and bogged down horses like invisible hands pulling them into the muck. Henry V's army shouldn't have stood a chance. His men were starving, sick with dysentery, their numbers whittled down to barely 6,000 after a brutal march across France. Across the field, the French nobility gleamed in their polished armor, 30,000 strong, so confident of victory they'd already begun arguing over who would capture the English king. But Henry understood something his enemies didn't. Battles aren't won by numbers alone. They're won by turning the very ground beneath your feet into an ally, and by the lethal hum of a longbow string. The French charge was meant to be a spectacle, a crushing wave of mounted knights in shining plate armor. Instead, it became a slaughter. The English longbowmen, positioned behind sharpened stakes, loosed volley after volley into the sky. Their arrows, tipped with bodkin points designed to punch through armor, rained down like steel hail. Horses screamed and fell, knights tumbled into the mud, and the charge dissolved into chaos. Those who survived the arrows found themselves trapped, their heavy armor sinking them deeper into the mire. their lances useless in the close press of bodies. The English men-at-arms, wielding axes and swords, waded into the fray with brutal efficiency, but the real catastrophe was French arrogance. Their commanders, steeped in chivalric tradition, had dismissed the longbow as a peasant's weapon, refusing to adapt their tactics. They funneled their forces into a narrow valley, negating their numerical advantage, while Henry exploited every inch of the terrain. Even the weather conspired against them. Overnight rain had turned the field into a swamp, and the French, weighed down by pride and plate, floundered like drowning men. By day's end, the scale of the defeat was unimaginable. Thousands of French nobles lay dead, their bodies piled so high they formed grisly barriers. Henry's victory wasn't just a military miracle, it was a social earthquake. The longbow, once mocked, became the great equalizer, proving that discipline and innovation could topple the old order. Agincourt didn't just change the course of the 100 Years' War, it shattered the myth of invincible nobility, reminding the world that no army, no matter how grand, is immune to the bite of mud and the whistle of an arrow finding its mark. The smoke from burning villages had already reached the gates of Vienna when the Ottomans arrived, a vast, unstoppable tide of 150,000 soldiers, their siege guns hammering the city's walls like a death knell. Inside, Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg's defenders were starving, riddled with disease, and down to their last barrels of gunpowder. The situation was beyond desperate. It was a countdown to annihilation. But what the Ottomans didn't realize was that halfway across Europe, a coalition was forming not out of convenience but necessity. King John III Sobieski of Poland didn't just see a besieged city, he saw the last line holding back an empire. And he was about to rewrite history with hooves and steel. Timing was everything. The Ottomans, confident in their overwhelming numbers, had grown lax. Their trenches zigzagged haphazardly, their scouts failed to notice the dust clouds rising in the distance. Sobieski's forces, Polish winged hussars, Bavarian infantry, Saxon cavalry moved like a storm gathering strength. But the real genius wasn't just in the arrival, it was in the deception. Sobieski ordered his men to light extra campfires each night, tricking Ottoman spies into believing reinforcements were still days away. Meanwhile, his army crept closer, hidden by the rugged terrain of the Vienna woods. Then came the charge. At 4 in the afternoon on September 12th, the hills above Vienna erupted with motion 18,000 horsemen, their armor glittering, their wings wooden frames adorned with eagle feathers humming like 1,000 arrows in flight. The Ottomans, mid-assault on the city's crumbling walls, barely had time to turn before the earth itself seemed to quake. The hussars didn't just hit the Ottoman lines, they shattered them, spears splintering against silk banners, sabers flashing through the smoke. It wasn't a battle, it was a tidal wave, but Sobieski's victory wasn't just brute force. He'd studied the Ottoman formations for weeks, identifying their weak point, their overstretched supply lines and the sheer arrogance of their command. The Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa, had been so fixated on Vienna's gold that he'd ignored the threat at his back. By the time he realized his mistake, his army was already routing, abandoning tents, treasure, and even the Sultan's sacred battle standard in their panic. The aftermath rippled far beyond that blood-soaked field. Vienna didn't just survive, it became the turning point where Ottoman expansion cracked and splintered. Sobieski's charge, the largest cavalry assault ever recorded, didn't just save a city. It reshaped the map of Europe, proving that even the mightiest empire could be broken by a coalition of the willing, a well-timed strike, and the unyielding belief that some walls are worth defending to the last breath. The mission was supposed to be simple: guard the supply depot at Rorke's Drift while the main British column pursued Zulu forces. No one expected trouble. But when survivors from the shattered camp at Isandlwana staggered in with news of catastrophe, 4,000 Zulus sweeping toward them, Lieutenants John Chard and Gonville Bromhead faced an impossible choice: flee and be hunted down in open country, or stand their ground against an avalanche of spears. With barely 150 men, most of them sick or inexperienced, they chose to fight. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in turning desperation into an unbreakable defense. First came the barricades, using sacks of mealy corn, biscuit boxes, even overturned wagons. The soldiers transformed the mission station into a labyrinth of death. Every gap between buildings became a choke point, every window a murder hole. But raw materials alone couldn't save them. It was the discipline that stunned the Zulus. Chard drilled his men to fire in controlled volleys, creating an unrelenting storm of lead. When one section reloaded, another took its place, maintaining a rhythm so precise the Zulu warriors later described it as rain that never ceased. Yet the true test came after dark. As wave after wave of attackers surged forward, the defenders ran low on ammunition. Bayonets snapped, rifles overheated, and the air thickened with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. That's when the real miracle happened. The wounded propped themselves against walls to keep shooting. Cooks and musicians grabbed rifles, and Bromhead led midnight countercharges to reclaim fallen positions. The Zulus, accustomed to overwhelming foes through sheer numbers, found themselves baffled by men who refused to break. By dawn, the ground around Rorke's Drift was littered with hundreds of Zulu casualties, while the tiny garrison, exhausted, bleeding but unbroken, still held the ruins. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded, the most for any single battle in British history. But the real lesson wasn't in medals, it was in how ordinary men, when united by leadership and purpose, could forge something extraordinary. The Zulus had the numbers, the momentum, the battle-hardened warriors. What they couldn't match was the cold, calculated fury of soldiers who knew there was no retreat, only hold or die. The Alamo wasn't just a mission, it was a crumbling symbol of defiance. Its adobe walls baking under the Texas sun as Santa Anna's army, thousands strong, closed in like a noose. Inside, fewer than 200 rebels, farmers, adventurers, even a famed frontiersman named Jim Bowie, faced impossible odds. They knew the math, no reinforcements were coming, no negotiation would spare them. Yet for 13 days they turned every corridor, every shattered window into a killing ground, buying time with their lives. The fall was inevitable, but the legacy, that would echo far beyond those blood-stained walls. What makes the Alamo's story unforgettable isn't the defeat, it's the alchemy of sacrifice and symbolism. Santa Anna thought crushing the rebels would terrify Texas into submission. Instead, their last stand became a beacon, the rallying cry, "Remember the Alamo." Wasn't just about vengeance, it was a testament to the power of stubborn courage. When Sam Houston's forces later routed the Mexicans at San Jacinto, they didn't just charge, they screamed those words like a battle hymn, their fury sharpened by the memory of men who'd chosen to die on their feet. But the real genius of the Alamo's defenders lay in their staging. Bowie, Travis, and Crockett weren't just fighters, they were storytellers, even in their final hours. Travis's dramatic line in the sand, giving men the choice to stay or flee, turned a military disaster into a parable of free will. Crockett, the folk hero, reportedly played his fiddle on the ramparts as shells fell, weaving myth into the chaos. These weren't just tactics, they were seeds planted in the imagination of a nation, and the ripple effects, they reshaped a continent. The Alamo's defiance didn't just inspire Texas independence, it fueled America's westward expansion, proving that even a lost battle could win a war of ideals. Today, those ruins aren't just a monument to the fallen. They're a masterclass in how hopeless fights can forge unbreakable resolve. The defenders didn't live to see victory, but their shadow stretched farther than Santa Anna's empire ever could. Some defeats don't end stories, they ignite them. The gates of Derry slammed shut with a finality that echoed through history. Inside the walled city, 30,000 Protestant civilians, men, women, and children, faced an impossible choice: surrender to the Catholic Jacobite army or starve. They chose defiance. For 105 grueling days, the siege dragged on, the air thick with the stench of rotting horseflesh and gunpowder, the streets lined with hollow-eyed survivors gnawing on boiled leather for sustenance. Yet through it all, not a single voice rose to open the gates. What held them together wasn't just desperation, it was something far more potent, a shared identity forged in the fires of persecution. Their secret weapon, the no-surrender ethos chanted from the ramparts like a psalm. The defenders weren't just fighting for land, they were guarding the very idea of their survival as a community. When Jacobite negotiators floated promises of mercy, the response came from an 80-year-old preacher, George Walker, who climbed the battered walls and declared, "The Lord will provide." And in their darkest hour, Providence arrived not as a miracle but as ingenuity. A makeshift flotilla of ships braving enemy fire broke through the blockade with barrels of salted beef and peas. The Mountjoy, its hull splintered by cannon fire, rammed the boom across the River Foyle, its crew sacrificing their vessel to keep hope afloat, but faith alone didn't man the walls. The defenders organized like a machine, rationing crumbs of bread, repurposing church bells into cannonballs, and posting children as lookouts. Every citizen became a soldier, every alley a barricade. When the Jacobites tunneled beneath the walls, Derry's women dumped boiling water and quicklime into the shafts, their aprons stained with the chemistry of survival. Unity wasn't just a virtue here, it was arithmetic. The moment even one faction wavered, the city would fall. When the siege finally lifted, the cost was etched into the faces of the living, half the population dead, the cobblestones slick with the memory of suffering. Yet Derry stood. Its legacy wasn't just in the broken Jacobite campaign, but in the unshakable truth it carved into history, that a people bound by collective purpose can endure beyond the limits of flesh and hunger. The walls still stand today, not as relics of division, but as monuments to a simple, staggering fact, that sometimes the will to outlast your oppressors is the most devastating weapon of all. The pass at Thermopyli was a butcher's alley waiting to happen, a narrow strip of land wedged between cliffs and sea, so tight that only a handful of men could stand shoulder to shoulder. When King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans marched in, they weren't just picking a battlefield, they were turning geography into a weapon. The Persian Empire, with its endless ranks of soldiers, could drown nations in sheer numbers. But here, in this rocky throat of land, numbers meant nothing. Only courage would count. Leonidas understood something deeper than tactics. He knew the power of symbolism. His 300 weren't just warriors, they were a message carved in steel. Each shield, each scarlet cloak, was a dare to the Persian king Xerxes, who'd expected Greece to crumble at the sight of his army. Instead, he found men who laughed in the face of certain death. When Xerxes sent envoys demanding their weapons, Leonidas famously replied, "Come and take them." It wasn't just defiance, it was psychological warfare, a refusal to even acknowledge the possibility of defeat. For 3 days, the Spartans turned Thermopyli into a slaughterhouse. The Persians, forced to attack in small groups, were butchered in droves, their wicker shields splintering under Spartan spears, their light armor useless against the disciplined phalanx. Even the elite immortals, Xerxes' finest, broke against that unyielding wall. But Leonidas's real genius lay in the long game. Every hour the Spartans held was another hour for Athens to evacuate, for Greece to rally. This wasn't just a last stand, it was a delayed tactic written in blood. Then came the betrayal. A local shepherd showed the Persians a hidden path, allowing them to flank the Greeks. Leonidas, knowing the end had come, dismissed most of the allied forces, but his Spartans stayed. Why? Because retreat would have shattered the myth they'd built, the idea that some things are worth dying for. Their final moments weren't just a fight, they were theater. Hacking at the enemy with broken swords, fists, even teeth, they forced the Persians to kill them again and again, each death etching their legend deeper into history. Thermopyli's legacy isn't in the Persian victory, it's in the fire it lit. Weeks later, at Salamis, a united Greek fleet crushed Xerxes' navy, turning the tide of the war. The 300 had lost the battle, but their sacrifice won the war, and that's why this ancient clash still echoes in medieval sieges and modern underdog tales. Because Thermopylae proved that sometimes the right fight in the right place can change the world, not by surviving, but by refusing to yield. The Fortress of Chittorga rose from the Rajasthani desert like a lion's last stand, its massive walls scarred by centuries of battles, yet unbroken. When Akbar's Mughal army arrived in 1567, their cannons outnumbered the stars, their ranks stretched farther than the horizon. Inside those walls, Rana Pratap and his Rajput warriors faced a simple, brutal equation: surrender and accept Mughal rule, or fight until the stones themselves turned to dust. They chose the latter, igniting a siege that would become less about conquest and more about the soul of a people. What made Chittorga different wasn't just the length of the siege, it was the way the Rajputs weaponized every moment of it. They knew they couldn't win in the traditional sense. Akbar's forces had gunpowder, elephants, and near limitless supplies. But the Rajputs had something far more dangerous, a cultural code that elevated defiance to divinity. For them, death in battle wasn't defeat, it was a passport to honor. So they fought not to survive, but to etch their names into eternity. The tactics were as ingenious as they were desperate. When Mughal sappers tunneled beneath the walls, the Rajputs flooded the passages with boiling oil. When Akbar's cannons breached the gates, they filled the gaps with layers of sandbags and rubble, forcing the Mughals to fight for every inch. Even the women of Chittorga became part of the defense, not with swords, but with a chilling ritual. As the situation grew hopeless, hundreds performed johar, a final act of defiance where they immolated themselves rather than face capture. The men, knowing their families were beyond the enemy's reach, then rode out for one last suicidal charge, their saffron robes streaming like flames. Yet the real legacy of Chittorga lies beyond the battlefield. Akbar won the fort, but he couldn't claim the spirit of the Rajputs. Rana Pratap, escaping before the final fall, became a living symbol of resistance, launching a guerrilla war that drained Mughal resources for decades. His defiance inspired generations, proof that even in loss, a people's courage could shape history. Today, Chittorga isn't just ruins. It's a testament to the unbreakable equation that sometimes the fiercest battles aren't fought for land, but for the right to say, "We were here." And that echo lasts longer than any empire. The slopes above Lake Eger were silent that morning, too silent. The Habsburg knights, clad in gleaming armor and confident in their overwhelming numbers, marched along the narrow path between the lake and the steep forested hills. They had come to crush a rebellion, to remind these upstart Swiss peasants of their place. What they didn't know was that the forest itself had become a weapon, and the peasants they dismissed as rabble were about to rewrite the rules of war. The Swiss didn't fight like knights, they fought like the land itself. Their weapons were humble, halberds, axes, wooden clubs studded with nails, but their real advantage was the terrain. As the Habsburg column snaked through the pass, the Swiss triggered a deadly trap. Boulders and logs came crashing down from above, splitting the armored ranks into chaos. Then, from the trees, the peasants surged forward, their halberds hooking knights from their saddles, their axes finding the weak points in plate armor. The narrow path became a death trap. Knights, unable to maneuver, were slaughtered like cattle in a chute. What made Morgarten a masterpiece wasn't just the ambush, it was the psychology behind it. The Swiss had studied their enemy's arrogance. The Habsburgs expected a stand-up fight, a clash of lines where their superior training and equipment would prevail. Instead, they got a brawl in the mud where a farmer's knowledge of the land trumped a nobleman's pedigree. The Swiss didn't just win the battle, they shattered the myth of knightly invincibility, proving that discipline, terrain, and sheer audacity could topple an empire's finest. And the ripple effects, they shaped a nation. Morgarten wasn't just a victory, it was the birth of Swiss identity. The cantons, once divided, saw what unity could achieve. Their tactics, ambushes, mobility, turning the land itself against invaders became the blueprint for centuries of Swiss defense. Even today, the echoes of Morgarten linger in Switzerland's tradition of neutrality and militia service. Because sometimes history isn't made by kings and castles, but by peasants who refuse to kneel, and by the unforgiving ground they choose to stand on. The English had Orleans in a stranglehold. Their fortresses ringed the city like a noose, their archers picking off anyone who dared approach the walls. Inside, the French defenders were starving, demoralized, and on the verge of collapse. The 100 Years' War had ground them down to a single, bleak truth. God, it seemed, had abandoned France. Then, on a chill March evening in 1429, a 17-year-old peasant girl rode into camp with a message that would shatter the stalemate, not just of the siege, but of history itself. Joan of Arc didn't just bring a sword, she brought something far more dangerous, unshakable conviction. Her arrival was less like reinforcement and more like lightning striking dry tinder. The French commanders scoffed. What could this illiterate farm girl know of war? But Joan understood something they'd forgotten. Battles aren't won by numbers alone. They're won by the fire in men's hearts. When she knelt before the Dauphin, Charles, and declared she'd been sent by God to save France, it wasn't just piety, it was psychological warfare. Her very presence forced a question. What if she was right? That doubt, whispered in the halls of power and the trenches alike, became her weapon. Then came the audacity. Joan didn't wait for permission. Clad in white armor, she marched straight to Orleans, rallying troops who'd spent months in retreat. Her strategy was as bold as it was simple: attack where the English least expected it. While their commanders debated her sanity, she led a night assault on the fortress of St. Loup, her banner cutting through the smoke as French soldiers, electrified by her fearlessness, stormed the walls. But Joan's real genius wasn't in the fighting, it was in the theatrics. She didn't just lead charges, she performed them. When an arrow struck her thigh during the attack on Les Tourelles, she yanked it out herself and climbed back into the fray, blood staining her armor. The message was unmistakable. If a girl could bleed for France, so could they. The English, for all their discipline, had no answer to this. Their meticulous siegecraft relied on predictable enemies, not a force galvanized by what seemed like divine intervention. When Joan's troops finally broke through to Orleans' starving citizens, it wasn't just supplies they delivered, it was the oxygen of hope. Within days, the English fortresses fell one by one, their garrisons fleeing before a tide of French soldiers who now fought like men possessed. The ripple effects reached far beyond Orleans. Joan's victory didn't just lift the siege, it shattered the myth of English invincibility. Charles, once a hesitant figurehead, was crowned king at Rheims, his legitimacy cemented by her triumphs. The 100 Years' War, which had seemed a foregone conclusion, twisted into a new phase, one where France, against all odds, began to rise. Yet the true lesson of Orleans isn't in the tactics or the politics. It's in the alchemy of belief. Joan didn't win because she was a military prodigy. She won because she made people see the impossible as inevitable. When she stood on those walls, shouting over the din of battle, she wasn't just commanding soldiers, she was rewriting the story they told themselves. And that's why 5 centuries later her name still echoes, not because she changed history, but because she proved that sometimes all it takes to change history is someone willing to stand up and say, "Follow me." The island of Cyprus had already fallen when the Ottomans turned their gaze toward Famagusta, a Venetian fortress clinging to the eastern coast like a last defiant sentinel. By the summer of 1570, the city stood alone, surrounded by an Ottoman force numbering in the tens of thousands, their cannons trained on walls that had never been meant to withstand such fury. Inside, Marco Antonio Bragadin and his 7,000 defenders faced a grim calculus: surrender and risk massacre, or fight until the very stones crumbled. They chose the latter, not knowing their stand would become a masterclass in turning desperation into defiance. What made Famagusta extraordinary wasn't just the length of the siege, it was the sheer ingenuity of its defense. Bragadin, a seasoned engineer, transformed the city into a labyrinth of traps. When Ottoman sappers dug tunnels to plant explosives beneath the walls, the Venetians countermined, collapsing the passages with carefully timed blasts. When the enemy's cannons pounded the bastions by day, Venetian laborers worked through the night, rebuilding with rubble and makeshift mortar. Even the harbor became a weapon. Chains stretched across its entrance, forcing Ottoman ships into deadly crossfires from hidden gun emplacements. But the real battle wasn't just against the Ottomans, it was against time itself. As months dragged on, food stores dwindled to rats and boiled leather. Dysentery and scurvy stalked the streets, yet Bragadin's leadership held the line. He rationed every crumb, organized patrols to prevent panic, and even staged mock feasts atop the walls to taunt the Ottomans with illusions of plenty. His greatest trick, firing the last of their precious gunpowder in sporadic volleys, creating the illusion of endless ammunition. The Ottomans, baffled by the defenders' stamina, began to wonder if Famagusta was somehow immune to starvation. Then came the betrayal. Venetian relief fleets promised for months never arrived. By August 1571, the city was a shell, its walls breached, its defenders skeletal. Bragadin, recognizing the end, negotiated terms, safe passage for his men in exchange for surrender. What followed was a horror that would echo through history. The Ottomans, enraged by their losses, flayed Bragadin alive, his skin paraded as a trophy. Yet even in this grotesque finale, Famagusta's defiance bore fruit. The siege had cost the Ottomans over 50,000 lives and delayed their Mediterranean ambitions by a critical year-time. Venice, used to fortify Crete and rally Europe. Famagusta's legacy isn't in its fall, but in the fractures it left in Ottoman invincibility. The siege proved that even against overwhelming force, a determined garrison could bleed an empire dry. Bragadin's skin might have been stolen, but his resolve became immortal, a reminder that some stands aren't measured in victory or defeat, but in the scars they leave on history's conquerors. The fields near Craey were a tapestry of chaos that August day. Mud churned into froth by hooves, the sky darkening as if nature itself recoiled from what was about to unfold. On one side stood the flower of French chivalry, knights clad in gleaming plate armor, their banners fluttering with the arrogance of centuries of battlefield dominance. Opposite them, outnumbered 3-1, were King Edward III's English forces, a ragged mix of longbowmen, many of them peasants, their weapons little more than polished yew staves and hemp strings. What happened next wasn't just a battle, it was the moment medieval warfare's old order crumpled like parchment in a fire. The French charge should have been a massacre, just not the one history recorded. Their knights, weighed down by armor and tradition, thundered across the sodden ground, confident their momentum alone would shatter the English lines. Instead, they met a storm of arrows so thick it blotted out the sun. The longbowmen, trained from childhood to draw with lethal precision, loosed volley after volley, their bodkin-tipped shafts punching through armor like it was parchment. Horses screamed and fell, knights tumbled into the muck, and the charge dissolved into a tangled, writhing nightmare. This wasn't combat, it was industrial slaughter, a revolution forged in the space between a bowstring's twang and a nobleman's gasp. But Crecy's genius wasn't just in the longbow, it was in the English refusal to play by the old rules. Edward had positioned his men on a slope, forcing the French to charge uphill into the killing zone. He'd ordered pits dug to break the cavalry's momentum, turning the battlefield into a death trap. Most crucially, he'd bet everything on discipline. While the French commanders squabbled over honor and glory, the English archers stood in silent ranks, their movements choreographed like a macabre dance. The result, a single day erased the myth of knightly invincibility, proving that tactics and technology could trump birthright and brute force. The aftermath rippled far beyond that blood-soaked field. Crecy didn't just win a battle, it rewrote the social contract of war. Suddenly, kings realized a peasant with a longbow was worth a dozen armored nobles, and that realization upended feudal hierarchies. The longbow became England's great equalizer, its shadow stretching across the 100 Years' War and beyond. But the true lesson of Crecy wasn't in the arrows or the armor. It was in the quiet, terrifying power of innovation, the moment the underdog stopped trying to win the old game and instead changed the rules entirely. The island of Rhodes shimmered like a mirage in the Aegean sun. When Suleiman the Magnificent's fleet arrived, 400 ships disgorging 100,000 soldiers onto its shores. Against this tidal wave of Ottoman might stood the Knights Hospitaller, a brotherhood of warriors so few they could barely man the walls. Their Grand Master, Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, surveyed the approaching storm with grim resolve. He knew Rhodes couldn't hold forever, but time wasn't the point. Every day the Knights delayed the Ottomans was a day Europe had to prepare. What followed wasn't just a siege, it was a masterclass in making defeat costlier than victory. From the first cannon blast, the Knights rewrote the rules of defense. Rhodes wasn't just a fortress, it was a honeycomb of death. Hidden gun emplacements covered every angle, tunnels allowed defenders to shift unseen, and the Knights had spent years stockpiling gunpowder in quantities that stunned the Ottomans. When Suleiman's sappers tunneled beneath the bastions, the Hospitallers detonated countermines, collapsing the passages with ear-splitting roars. Even the harbor became a weapon. Chains strung across its mouth forced Ottoman ships into kill zones where enfilading fire turned the water crimson. But the real battle wasn't fought with gunpowder alone. The Knights understood psychology. They launched nightly sorties not to break the siege but to shatter Ottoman morale. Clad in black cloaks, they slipped into enemy camps like ghosts, leaving behind chaos and the whispered fear that no man was safe, even among thousands. When Suleiman offered honorable surrender, El-Isle Adam refused, not out of pride but to buy more time. Each refusal forced the Ottomans to spend lives and supplies on another assault, another week of grinding attrition. By December, Rhodes was a charnel house. the knights, reduced to eating horses and rats, fought from ruins with notched swords and splintered pikes. Yet their stubbornness had already altered history. Suleiman, expecting a swift victory, had instead lost nearly half his army, a blow that delayed his European ambitions for years. When the gates finally opened, the Sultan, in a rare display of respect, allowed the surviving knights to depart with their arms and honor intact. Rhodes fell, but its legacy endured. The siege proved that even in defeat, resistance could shape empires. The Hospitallers, exiled to Malta, would later use the lessons of Rhodes to withstand another Ottoman onslaught. Their 6-month stand wasn't just a military feat, it was a manifesto. Sometimes the measure of victory isn't in holding ground, but in forcing your enemy to pay for every inch in blood and time. And that's a lesson that echoes far beyond crumbling walls. The hills around Alesia bristled with wooden towers and trenches, not just one set, but two. Julius Caesar, the master of turning desperation into dominance, had done something no Gallic warrior could fathom. He'd built walls facing both inward and outward, trapping Vercingetorix's army inside while daring a massive relief force to break through from the outside. This wasn't just a siege, it was a chessboard where every move was calculated to force checkmate. The Gallic chieftain had picked Alesia for its natural defenses, a hilltop fortress surrounded by rivers and steep slopes. But Caesar saw what others missed. Terrain could be manipulated just like men. Roman engineering didn't just build barriers, it weaponized the land itself. The inner wall, stretching 9 miles, was studded with watchtowers, ditches filled with sharpened stakes, and even pits disguised with brushwood, a nightmare for any attacker. But the outer wall, nearly 14 miles long, was the real stroke of genius. Caesar knew the Gauls would summon reinforcements, so he prepared to fight 2 armies at once. When Vercingetorix's cavalry broke out to rally tribes across Gaul, they returned with a host numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Yet Caesar's legions, dug in like ticks, held firm. The Gauls hurled themselves at the walls by day and night, their attacks coordinated by flaming signals from the fortress above. But every assault crashed against Roman discipline, ballista bolts thudding into flesh, volleys of pila skewering the brave, and trenches swallowing the desperate. What made Alesia a masterclass wasn't just the engineering, it was the psychological warfare. Caesar's men weren't just defending, they were taunting. When Gauls tried to fill the trenches with dirt and bodies, the Romans rolled barrels of burning pitch down the slopes, turning the battlefield into an inferno. When tribesmen scaled the walls, they found the top bristling with rotating hooks that ripped them from the ramparts. Even the Roman food supply became a weapon. Caesar publicly slaughtered his few remaining cattle to convince the Gauls his men were well fed, while inside Alesia, Vercingetorix's people starved, their horses butchered, their hope crumbling like the fortress walls. The end came not with a climactic charge, but with a whimper. Vercingetorix, watching his people eat grass and leather, rode alone through the gates in polished armor, surrendering at Caesar's feet. The relief force, demoralized by failure, melted away, but the battle's echo reached far beyond that bloodied hill. Medieval commanders, studying Caesar's notes, would later replicate his double-wall tactic in sieges from Jerusalem to Constantinople. Alesia proved that victory isn't just about numbers or courage. It's about controlling the battlefield so completely that even your enemy's strength becomes their weakness. And sometimes the greatest conquests are built not on open plains, but in the minds of those who dare to think beyond them. The cliffs of Masada rose like a shattered crown from the Dead Sea's Eger, a fortress so remote, so inhospitable, that even the Romans hesitated. By the year 73, Jerusalem had fallen, the temple was ashes, and the last remnants of Jewish resistance had fled to this barren rock. 960 men, women, and children stared down the might of Rome's 10th Legion, knowing surrender meant slavery or crucifixion. What followed wasn't just a siege, it was a haunting study in how defiance can outlast empires. Masada's power lay in its impossibility. The rebels, led by Eleazar ben Yair, had turned Herod the Great's luxurious palace fortress into a labyrinth of desperation. Roman engineers, masters of siegecraft, built a colossal ramp of earth and timber, inching their battering rams toward the walls, but the defenders had prepared. They stockpiled food in hidden cisterns, repurposed Roman armor scavenged from dead soldiers, and even built their own counter-ramparts from the fortress's shattered stones. Every Roman advance was met with ingenuity boulders hurled down the cliffs, burning pitch searing through siege towers, and at night, the eerie silence of a people who refused to beg for mercy. Yet the true brilliance of Masada wasn't in the physical defense, it was in the psychology. The rebels knew they couldn't win, but they could deny Rome the satisfaction of conquest. When the walls finally crumbled under the battering rams, the Romans stormed in at dawn only to find silence. The storerooms burned, the weapons discarded, and the defenders lying still in familial embrace. They had chosen death on their own terms, drawing lots to determine who would wield the final knife. Even the Roman soldiers, hardened by war, reportedly stood frozen at the sight. Why does Masada echo through millennia? Not because of the tactics or the terrain, but because it distilled resistance into its purest form. The rebels didn't fight for victory, they fought for the right to say no. Their story, preserved by the historian Josephus, became a mirror for every oppressed people who'd rather fall free than kneel alive. Modern Israel's military swears its oaths on this cliff, not to glorify suicide, but to honor the unbreakable calculus that some lines once drawn in the sand must never be crossed. Masada's lesson isn't about how to die, it's about how to live when living itself is the battleground. The Crusaders who marched toward Nicopolis in 1396 carried more than swords and banners, they carried the weight of centuries of holy war. French knights, Hungarian cavalry, and German mercenaries, all united under the banner of Christendom, believed victory was inevitable. Their armor gleamed, their confidence unshaken even as they ventured deep into Ottoman territory. But beneath the surface, fault lines ran deep. The French nobles, convinced of their superiority, dismissed their Hungarian allies as backward. Supplies ran low, discipline frayed, and worst of all, they underestimated Bayezid the Thunderbolt, the Ottoman Sultan who had spent years preparing for this moment. What followed wasn't just a defeat, it was a massacre disguised as a battle. The Crusaders, ignoring scouts' warnings, charged headlong into Ottoman positions, only to find themselves trapped between hidden stakes and a storm of arrows. Bayezid's secret weapon, his disciplined janissaries standing firm while his cavalry feigned retreat, luring the overeager knights into a killing zone. The French vanguard, weighed down by armor, became easy prey for Ottoman infantry wielding hooked polearms designed to drag riders from their saddles. By nightfall, the field was littered with the flower of European chivalry, their bodies a grim testament to the cost of arrogance. Yet Nicopolis' true legacy wasn't in the bloodshed, it was in the lessons etched into Europe's collective memory. For the first time, kingdoms realized that crusading zeal alone couldn't defeat the Ottomans. The disaster forced a reckoning. Without unity, without adapting to the enemy's tactics, even the mightiest armies would shatter. Future commanders from Hunyadi to Vlad the Impaler studied Nicopolis' mistakes, prioritizing disciplined infantry and flexible strategies over reckless charges. But the most profound shift was psychological. The Ottomans, once seen as a distant threat, now loomed as an existential danger. Nicopolis didn't just end a crusade. It marked the moment Europe stopped viewing the East as a land of conquest and started bracing for survival. Sometimes the most enduring victories aren't won on the battlefield, but in the minds of those who survive to fight smarter next time. The waters of the Bosporus churned black with smoke the day the Umayyad fleet arrived, 1,200 ships carrying 80,000 warriors, their prows slicing toward Constantinople like teeth bared for the kill. Inside the Theodosian walls, Emperor Leo III faced annihilation. The Arab armies had already swallowed Persia, Syria, Egypt. Why would the Byzantine capital be any different? But Constantinople wasn't just a city, it was a fortress of the mind as much as stone, and Leo held two cards no one saw coming: a weapon that burned water and a genius for turning enemies into unwitting allies. Greek fire wasn't just a flamethrower, it was alchemy wrought in war. Byzantine chemists had concocted a liquid nightmare that clung to ships and skin, igniting even on waves, its recipe so secret that today we still don't know its full composition. As the Umayyad fleet closed in, bronze tubes mounted on Byzantine dromons spewed jets of this infernal substance, turning the sea into a sheet of flame. Panic ripped through the Muslim ranks as sailors leaped into water that burned hotter than desert sand. But Leo's real stroke of brilliance lay in the timing. He waited until the Arab ships were packed tight in the Golden Horn, then unleashed hell. The fire didn't just destroy, it traumatized, seeding a terror so deep that later Muslim chroniclers would call it the work of demons. Yet fire alone couldn't save a city. Leo, a former shepherd who'd risen through sheer wit, played the long game. He'd secretly allied with the Bulgars, promising them gold to harry the Arabs from the north. When Umayyad troops, starving after a brutal winter, scattered to forage, Bulgar cavalry fell upon them like wolves. Meanwhile, Byzantine spies spread dissent among the besiegers, whispering that reinforcements from Damascus would never come. The caliph's own generals began questioning the siege, their resolve crumbling like the rotting corpses piling outside the walls. Then came the coup de grace, nature itself turned traitor. That winter was the fiercest in memory. The Bosporus froze solid, Arab supply lines snapped, and plague stalked the camps. By spring, the Umayyads retreated, their ranks halved by battle, hunger, and despair. Constantinople stood, and with it the flame of Eastern Orthodoxy. Why does this siege still matter? Because it wasn't just walls or weapons that won the day, it was the Byzantine art of survival. Leo proved that even against the apocalypse, a leader who masters both science and psychology can bend fate. The Arabs never seriously threatened Constantinople again. And that flaming secret, it bought Christendom 8 more centuries to endure, a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories aren't about destroying your enemy, but outthinking them until they destroy themselves. The Teutonic Knights rode onto the field of Grunwald like a steel tide, their white mantles emblazoned with black crosses fluttering beneath the July sun. For over 2 centuries, this warrior monk order had dominated the Baltic, carving out a theocratic state with sword and sermon. That day in 1410, they faced a combined Polish-Lithuanian force nearly twice their size, but numbers had never deterred the order before. Their discipline was legendary, their heavy cavalry the terror of Europe. Yet within hours, their Grand Master would lie dead in the mud, and their empire would begin its irreversible collapse. The tragedy of Grunwald wasn't that the knights lost, it was how close they came to winning, and how their own arrogance turned certain victory into ruin. The battle opened with a masterstroke. The Teutonic commander, Ulrich von Jungingen, had concealed elite cavalry behind his lines, waiting to unleash them at the perfect moment. When the Lithuanian wing of the Allied army broke under the Knights' initial charge, whether from genuine retreat or feigned collapse is still debated, the order's reserves thundered forward in pursuit, convinced the day was theirs. But in their zeal, they made a fatal miscalculation. They left their own infantry exposed. Polish forces under King W. Ladislaw Jagiello, holding the center, hadn't flinched. As the Knights galloped after the fleeing Lithuanians, Jagiello's fresh troops pivoted like a closing gate, slamming into the Teutonic flank. The order's charge, meant to be the killing blow, became their undoing, a lesson in how even the best laid plans shatter when commanders mistake opportunity for inevitability. Yet the Knights' failures ran deeper than tactics. Their very identity became their weakness. For generations, the order had cultivated an aura of invincibility, believing their divine mission made them unbeatable. That arrogance bred inflexibility. When Lithuanian forces regrouped and returned to the fight, their retreat revealed as a ruse, the Teutonic leadership froze. No contingency plans existed for such a reversal. Meanwhile, Jagiello, the pragmatic king who'd spent years studying his enemy's playbook, adapted on the fly. He used the Knights' own momentum against them, herding their scattered cavalry into marshy ground where their heavy armor became a death sentence. The final blow came from an unexpected quarter, the Teutonic mercenaries. Unlike the fanatical brother Knights, these hired swords had no loyalty beyond their pay. When the tide turned, many abandoned the field, leaving the order's core forces isolated. Here lay the cruelest irony. An institution built on absolute devotion had gambled its fate on men who fought for gold, not God. By sunset, the Teutonic dead included not just Grand Master Ulrich, but nearly every high-ranking officer, a decapitation strike that left their state reeling. Grunwald's legacy wasn't just a battlefield loss, it was the unmasking of a myth. The Teutonic Knights never regained their military supremacy, their decline accelerated by rebellious cities and shifting politics. Jagiello, in contrast, proved that victory often goes not to the strongest, but to those who stay humble enough to learn and flexible enough to change. The Knights' greatest mistake wasn't underestimating their enemies' numbers, but overestimating their own infallibility. And in that lesson lies a truth that echoes far beyond medieval battlefields. The moment you believe you cannot lose is the moment you've already begun to fall. The wind howled through the shattered ruins of Kars like a vengeful spirit, carrying with it the kind of cold that seeped into bones and froze gunpowder solid. It was the winter of 1855, and the Ottoman garrison, bolstered by a handful of British advisors, stood as the last obstacle to Russian domination of the Caucasus. Outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from reinforcements, their situation seemed hopeless, but the defenders had two unlikely allies, the merciless Anatolian winter and the sheer arrogance of their enemies. The Russians, confident in their numerical superiority, had expected a swift victory. They hadn't accounted for the ingenuity of British engineer William Fenwick Williams, who transformed Kars into a fortress of desperation. He ordered the digging of hidden trenches, the construction of camouflaged gun emplacements, and the stockpiling of every scrap of food and ammunition the city could scavenge. Yet his greatest weapon wasn't engineering, it was psychology. Knowing the Russians relied on intimidation, Williams staged elaborate ruses. At night, his men lit extra campfires along the walls, creating the illusion of a larger garrison. By day, they marched in looping formations, their tattered uniforms swapped between units to mimic fresh reinforcements. The Russians, peering through spyglasses, began doubting their own intelligence reports. But the true turning point came when winter tightened its grip. Supply lines, already stretched thin across the rugged terrain, snapped entirely. Russian soldiers, ill-equipped for the cold, began dying of frostbite in their trenches. Their cannons, mired in frozen mud, fell silent. Meanwhile, the defenders of Kars had turned scarcity into strategy. They melted snow for water, repurposed shattered timbers as fuel, and rationed moldy barley like treasure. Every frozen sunrise brought another day for Ottoman reinforcements to muster, another week for British diplomacy to pressure St. Petersburg. The siege dragged on for 5 grueling months, a war of attrition where shivering sentinels traded shots across no man's land. When the Russians finally breached the walls in November, it wasn't triumph they found, it was a hollow victory. The delay at Kars had cost them the campaign season, forcing them to abandon their advance. The Ottomans, though forced to surrender, had achieved something far greater. They'd exposed the fragility of Russian logistics, proving that even the mightiest armies could be broken not by steel, but by snow and stubbornness. Kars didn't just stall an invasion, it rewrote the rules of winter warfare, teaching a lesson that would echo from the Crimean trenches to the frozen fields of Stalingrad. The land itself is always the most unforgiving enemy. The morning of October 7, 1571, dawned with a stillness that belied the carnage to come. The Gulf of Patras was a mirror, its surface barely rippling as 2 of history's most formidable fleets drifted toward collision. The Ottoman Empire's 230 galleys against the Holy League's 212. On paper, the Turks held every advantage: veteran corsairs, superior numbers, and the confidence of decades dominating the Mediterranean. But the Christian alliance had spent the summer forging something the Ottomans couldn't quantify: a unity of purpose, welded together by Venetian shipwrights, Spanish marines, and a papal blessing. And beneath their decks lurked a secret weapon that would rewrite naval warfare: the galleys. These monstrous hybrids were the tanks of the 16th century, sea's floating fortresses that blended the oared speed of galleys with the firepower of warships. The Venetians had converted merchant hulls into these behemoths, mounting massive cannons on reinforced platforms that could pivot to unleash broadsides. As the Ottoman fleet advanced in their traditional crescent formation, aiming to board and overpower, the 6 galleasses anchored at the Christian vanguard did the unthinkable. They fired first. The roar of their guns tore through the morning calm, their iron shot smashing through Ottoman hulls before a single arrow could be loosed. In those opening minutes, the battle's trajectory was already bending. Yet technology alone didn't win Lepanto. The real innovation was in the coordination. The Holy League's commander, Don John of Austria, had drilled his polyglot fleet relentlessly, turning Spanish tercios, Venetian sailors, and Genoese mercenaries into a single organism. When the Ottomans tried to exploit gaps between Christian squadrons, reserve lines pivoted with precision, sealing breaches like a living wall. Even the rowers, many of them chained slaves, fought with desperate fury, knowing victory might mean freedom. Meanwhile, the Ottomans, for all their experience, were hamstrung by rigid hierarchies. Their captains waited for orders while the Christians adapted on the fly. The aftermath was a tableau of transformation. Over 200 Ottoman ships lay sunk or captured, their crimson sails floating on bloodied waters. The Christian losses were heavy, but the message was clear: the Ottoman navy wasn't invincible. Lepanto didn't just stop an empire's expansion, it shattered the myth of its inevitability. And the galleys, it became the prototype for the ships that would dominate the age of sail, proving that the future belongs not to those with the most ships, but to those who dare to reimagine them. What lingers isn't just the tactics or the tonnage, but the lesson woven through the smoke, that when fractured nations unite around a single moment, even the tide of history can be turned. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet within a year, but the psychological wound never fully healed. For the first time, Europe had glimpsed their weakness, and the Mediterranean would never feel quite so small again. Tyre wasn't just a city, it was a fortress sculpted by the sea itself. Perched on an island half a mile offshore, its towering walls rose straight from the Mediterranean, leaving no beach for attackers to land, no weak point to exploit. When Alexander the Great arrived in 332 B.C., fresh from crushing the Persians at Issus, he expected surrender. Instead, the Tyrians mocked him from their battlements, confident the waves would swallow his ambitions. What followed wasn't just a siege, it was a 7-month masterclass in how geography could defy even history's greatest conqueror. The first obstacle was the water itself. Alexander's engineers proposed the unthinkable, building a causeway across the strait to bring siege towers within striking distance, but the sea fought back. Tyrian warships darted from hidden harbors, raining fire arrows on the workers. Currents eroded the makeshift road, while divers sabotaged the foundations. Each cartload of rubble dumped into the waves seemed to vanish beneath the tide. Yet Alexander, in a stroke of adaptability, turned his weakness into strength. He commandeered ships from conquered ports, creating a floating shield around his construction crews. Step by painstaking step, the mole inched forward not just as a bridge, but as a symbol of human stubbornness against nature's design. Meanwhile, Tyre's defenders played their own game of deception. Their walls, thicker than any Alexander had seen, were just the beginning. Hidden sea gates allowed triremes to slip out under cover of night, striking Macedonian supply lines before melting back into the labyrinthine harbors. The Tyrians even weaponized the seafloor, dropping boulders to snag enemy anchors and funnel ships into kill zones where ballistae could pick them apart. Every advantage of their island position, the deep water anchorages, the submerged reefs became another layer of defense, but the true brilliance of Tyre's resistance lay in its psychological toll. As weeks stretched into months, Alexander's allies began to whisper, if this one city could stall the man who toppled Persia, was he truly invincible? The Tyrians, sensing their enemies' frustration, doubled down on theatrics. They staged mock sacrifices on the walls, taunting Alexander with shouts that their god Melkart would never abandon them. At one point, they even floated the corpses of executed Macedonian envoys past the besiegers' camp, a grisly message that surrender wasn't just unlikely, it was unthinkable. When the final assault came, it was as much about innovation as brute force. Alexander's siege towers, now within range, bristled with catapults that hurled not just stones but pots of burning sand, a horrific weapon that seeped through armor and flesh. His fleet, finally overwhelming Tyre's navy, used ship-mounted battering rams to breach the seaward walls. Yet even in collapse, the city's geography exacted a price. The Macedonians had to fight street by street, rooftop by rooftop, as defenders retreated into a maze of alleys designed to disorient invaders. Tyre's fall reshaped military history. Medieval commanders studying Alexander's notes would replicate his dual approach of blockade and engineering in sieges from Eger to Malta. But the deeper lesson wasn't about tactics, it was about terrain as a living ally. Tyre proved that a city could leverage every rock, every current, every gust of wind to magnify its strength. Centuries later, when Richard the Lionheart stared down the walls of Acre or Suleiman's cannons boomed at Rhodes, they weren't just facing stone and mortar. They were confronting the ghost of Tyre, whispering through the ages that some strongholds refuse to fall until the very sea itself turns against them. The morning of October 14, 1066, dawned with two armies staring across the rolling hills of Sussex, one exhausted from a forced march, the other desperate to claim a crown neither man had been born to inherit. Harold Godwinson's Saxon forces held the high ground at Senlac Ridge, their shield wall bristling with axes and spears, their flanks anchored by ancient woodland. Below them, William of Normandy's invaders, a mix of Norman knights, Breton mercenaries, and Flemish adventurers, faced the grim reality that failure meant no retreat, only slaughter on an alien shore. What unfolded that day wasn't just a battle for England's throne. It was a razor's-edge contest where split-second decisions and sheer exhaustion reshaped history. Harold's first advantage was terrain. The ridge forced William's cavalry, the terror of continental battlefields, to charge uphill into a wall of seasoned housecarls, their two-handed axes capable of cleaving through horse and rider alike. Early Norman assaults shattered against this living fortress, their dead piling in bloody heaps, but Harold's army had just raced 250 miles north to crush a Viking invasion at Stamford Bridge, then doubled back without rest. Every hour drained their stamina further, their shield arms trembling under the weight of splintered oak and iron. William, sensing this weakness, turned to psychological warfare. His archers loosed volleys high into the sky, forcing the Saxons to raise their shields. Then, at the critical moment, he ordered a feigned retreat. The sight of Norman knights fleeing in panic proved too tempting for some Saxon fieldmen who broke ranks to pursue. It was a fatal mistake. William's cavalry wheeled around, cutting down the isolated English before surging into gaps left in the shield wall. Yet the battle's true turning point came from something far darker than tactics, the rumor of William's death. When his horse was killed beneath him, panic rippled through the Norman ranks. A lesser commander might have crumbled, but William ripped off his helmet, riding bareheaded through the chaos to prove he lived. That single act of defiance reignited his army's morale while sowing doubt among the Saxons. Momentum, that invisible force that wins or loses battles, shifted irreversibly. By dusk, the ridge ran red. Harold, struck down by an arrow to the eye according to legend, left his men leaderless. The surviving housecarls fought to the last around his body, but the Norman cavalry finally shattered their lines. Hastings didn't just crown a conqueror, it exposed the fragility of medieval warfare, where victory could hinge on a feigned retreat, a lifted visor, or the stamina of men pushed beyond human limits. William's triumph wasn't inevitable. It was stolen through adaptability, opportunism, and the cruel arithmetic of exhaustion. And in that lesson lies the heart of every underdog story, that history doesn't favor the strong, but those who best read the moment. From the boiling oil of Szigetvár to the frozen trenches of Kars, these 25 battles aren't just footnotes in history, they're masterclasses in defying the inevitable. What unites them isn't just the staggering odds or the ingenuity of the defenders, but something far more profound. The undeniable truth that victory isn't always about who has the most soldiers or the biggest cannons. Sometimes it's about who refuses to accept the script they've been handed. Think of Zrinski's layered defenses at Szigetvár, buying precious time for Europe with every fallen soldier. Or the starving defenders of Derry, turning church bells into cannonballs and desperation into an unbreakable creed. These stories aren't about miracles, they're about the raw algebra of human grit, where courage multiplies the strength of the few against the many. But the real lesson here isn't just in the battles themselves, it's in what they reveal about the nature of resilience. Take Joan of Arc at Orleans, a teenage girl who didn't just rally an army but rewrote the narrative of an entire war. Or the Swiss peasants at Morgarten, who turned a forested hillside into a killing ground and shattered the myth of knightly invincibility. Time and again, we see the same pattern. When conventional strength fails, unconventional thinking prevails. The defenders of these battles didn't just resist, they reimagined the rules of engagement. They turned weaknesses into weapons, whether it was Malta's harbor chains or Crecy's rain of arrows. And let's not forget the psychological warfare woven through these clashes. Theatrics mattered as much as tactics. William Wallace's calculated ambush at Stirling Bridge wasn't just a military victory. It was a blow to English morale, proving their invincibility was a facade. Similarly, the rebels at Masada didn't just deny Rome a conquest. They turned their final act into a legend so potent it still resonates millennia later. These weren't just fights for land or power. They were battles for the stories future generations would tell. So why do these underdog victories still captivate us? Because they're not relics of the past, they're mirrors. They force us to ask, what would we do when backed into a corner? How far would we go to protect what matters? Whether it's the desperate last stand at the Alamo or the icy defiance at Kars, these stories remind us that history isn't written by the strong alone. It's written by those who dare to stand when the world expects them to kneel. Now it's your turn. Which of these impossible triumphs speaks to you? Is it the cunning of Eger's defenders, the unyielding faith at Derry, or the audacity of Sobieski's winged hussars charging into the Ottoman tide? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear which battle ignited your imagination. And if you're hungry for more tales of defiance against the odds, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, keep this in mind. No matter how hopeless the odds seem, history's greatest underdogs proved one thing again and again. The only battle you're guaranteed to lose is the one you